From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
21 Democratic attorneys general demand continued corporate diversity and equity policies from the Fortune 100 after 13 Republican attorneys general suggested that such policies might be illegal. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, columnist Alicia Finley and editorial board member Colin Levy. Our business is between a rock and a hard place now in the wake of the Supreme Court's decision banning racial preferences in college admissions. It certainly seems that way. This latest letter from 21 Democratic AGs came last week. I will read a portion of it. It says, "The letter you received from the 13 state attorneys general, meaning those Republicans, is intended to intimidate you into rolling back the progress many of you have made. We write to reassure you that corporate efforts to recruit diverse workforces and create inclusive work environments are legal and reduce corporate risk for claims of discrimination. In fact, businesses should double down on diversity-focused programs because there is still much more work to be done." Alicia, can you give us a sense of what is the legal argument that these Democratic AGs are making in contrast to the one that was made earlier by Republican AGs?
Well, they argue that a lot of these policies that Fortune 100 companies and actually other businesses use are really racially neutral, that they actually don't advantage any race over another. And they actually, cite examples such as expanded recruiting for minorities on college campuses, as well as mentorships that are available and open to everyone of all races. And in principle, they're right. These examples that they cite are actually, don't violate Equal Protection Clause or Title VII of the Civil Rights Act any more than similar efforts on college campuses or would be to, for instance, to recruit high school students at more diverse high schools or to, increase mentorship opportunities at schools for, Black or Hispanic kids. Those practices in themselves may not be illegal or unconstitutional. The rub here is that a lot of the practices the Republicans are really targeting are really hiring quotas or contracting quotas. And they include a link to a CNBC article that goes through a couple dozen companies and what their pledges and diversity pledges. And a lot of these are really racial balancing in disguise.
And Colin, as we discussed on last week's podcast about this, taking on the argument from the Republican attorneys general, it's true that the Supreme Court's decision in the Harvard affirmative action racial preferences case was about college admissions and universities that take federal funding, even if they are private schools. But it seems to be having much broader effects that are being recognized. And part of that has to do with these civil rights laws, Title VI that bans discrimination in programs with federal funding, Title VII that bans employment discrimination, that the Republican AGs are saying are generally read in harmony.
Right, that's right. And that's what Justice Gorsuch said in his concurrence. He said, look, a lot of the portions of this law that we've just considered also are mirrored in the law, Title VII, that governs corporations. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see the way this plays out, Kyle. I think there's no question that corporations are between a rock and a hard place here. I thought it was particularly funny in the letter that the Democratic AGs said that they thought the Republican AGs were trying to intimidate corporations into not using diversity metrics, because intimidating corporations is an art that Democrats have been really perfecting for the last decade, right? You think about the way every progressive group under the sun has moved against corporations on their preferred issues, expecting them to take up chosen causes, from the environment to the demand that pension funds are invested in ESG accounts or, obviously these racial issues that we're talking about. That kind of virtue signaling has been a problem on a basic level because when corporations make these decisions based on politics instead of based on merit or excellence, it affects their output, it affects their corporate culture. And there's no question that the left has created a general environment where, these companies lay out diversity metrics or vie to be visible sponsors of certain environmental or politically pleasing causes because they were hoping it was going to protect them from volatility in their business, or boycotts or other disruptions. But now we're seeing that it can really go the other way, right? I mean, we saw that most obviously. We saw that paradigm blow up in the recent backlash against Budweiser trying to support LGBTQ people by, using Dylan Mulvaney, and then they just lost the whole store. It kind of just blew up on them. And so I think as we look at these racial metrics that companies have been using trying to please everyone, I think there's also some real questions about these lawsuits that are coming and how all of this affects shareholders, because the real, again, old-fashioned thinking here, but, the real responsibility, especially for these large corporations, is to protect shareholder value.
But part of the legal analysis depends, it seems to me, on how these programs function in reality. So one thing that it sticks out in this letter from the Democratic AGs is they talk about aspirational diversity goals in hiring, which they say are not hiring quotas, which are unlawful under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. And Alicia, maybe it depends on whether in reality these goals that are being set by companies actually function as aspirational goals, or whether they are really intended to be policy levers in the hiring process. And that would be a fact-bound question that could depend on company to company. But it does raise the question of, if you are sitting in the CEO's chair, what are you supposed to do here? You're running a Fortune 100. You have a lot of employees and stakeholders. You have a letter from Republican AGs on your desk. You have a letter from Democratic AGs on your desk. And Alicia, one example that might be useful to talk about is Microsoft. I know you've looked at some of the targets that they've put in place. How do those seem to function?
So what's interesting about Microsoft is that, like a lot of the companies that came out with a diversity pledge soon after George Floyd's death. And part of the purpose of this diversity pledge was really, political protection, and to show that it's doing something about the social injustice and inequality. So it pledged to increase its Black-owned U.S. partners by 20% over 30 years and double the number of Black managers and senior leaders in its U.S. offices by 2025. Again, a lot of companies made similar pledges, fiddle around with the numbers, but they would actually put some kind of target, or would you describe it as aspirational goals for different kinds of, or different races or ethnicities in both their workforces and contracting partners, and that's really their contractors. And what was interesting was Microsoft was also under investigation at this point and had received a complaint by the Department of Labor's Federal Contracting Office that it was discriminating against Asians, Blacks, and Hispanics at different offices. And it was based on a statistical analysis that's known as disparate impact. It looked at the hiring and the share of applicants from these races and the share that they ended up hiring, and say, well, there's actually disparities, and this is evidence that you are discriminating against these people of different races, even though the irony, of course, is in some offices, they actually claimed, well, Asians were actually getting an advantage, and in other ones, the Asians were actually being at a disadvantage. So I don't think that's really evidence of systemic discrimination. In fact, I think it's evidence of the contrary. But in any case, Microsoft had this complaint, and it actually agreed to settle it rather than continue to fight for about $3 million in September 2020. And again, there were other big tech companies. Google had gotten slapped with a similar complaint. So had Oracle. There's a lady in this Department of Labor in the San Francisco Bureau that was basically going around and tried to stick it to the tech companies. She was later removed by the Trump administration. And a month later, around October 2020, Microsoft was actually received a letter saying, well, now we're investigating whether your diversity pledge is actually illegal. And so, again, this is a case in point of how companies can get stuck in this, catch-22. And I actually am of the view that Microsoft's diversity pledge should be illegal under the interpretation of the Students for Fair Admissions, both under Title VI, to the extent it's a federal contractor and receiving federal money, but also equal protection in Title VII.
Yeah, and that raises the point about whether these are aspirational goals or not. And Colin, to the point that the argument that Alicia was making, there are neutral ways of trying to increase diversity at companies. If you have historically only recruited from a small set of Ivy League schools, for example, you could say, we're going to broaden our pool of applicants by going and doing some heavy recruitment at really good flagship state schools where you're going to get equally smart, talented applicants who may have a different profile, and not even just racial profile, but different socioeconomic profile, different family history, different geographic profile than your pool beforehand. But the idea that these sorts of targets would be purely aspirational, I find myself pretty skeptical of that, because if you're sitting in the CEO's chair, you're someone who lives and dies by metrics and hitting those metrics. And the idea that they're going to set some sort of aspirational goal and not have real levers they want to pull to try to get there, I'm skeptical of that. And then even if they are trying to pull those neutral levers, it does create a situation where they know they're going to be measured by whether they hit that target or not. And boy, that creates a temptation, I think, to take the shortcut of something that would look more like a quota in order to hit the goal that you've already announced that you've set.
Right. I think what we're going to see, to be totally honest about it, is that companies are probably going to keep doing much of what they've been doing, but they're just going to stop talking about it. I mean, there's going to be massive website scrubbing in terms of all of these metrics that they've previously been advertising. And I think that's going to play out over the coming months. But, there's something else that I wanted to mention too, Kyle, because if you think about it, in some ways, this comparison between the universities and corporations, in some ways, universities had actually been more reined in by Supreme Court decisions governing affirmative action over the past maybe 10 or 12 years. And corporations actually had a little bit more room to run, or they thought they had more room to run in some ways with these ideas, because I think what they really said was, what they thought to themselves were, all these law firms and all these government contractors, all of them were sort of captured by this idea that this was how we were going to achieve racial equity. So I think the legal advice that many of these corporations were probably getting at the time was, all the law firms were basically saying, hey, who's actually going to come after you for trying to achieve these goals, which we now see as a universal good. And I think it's really important, too, to note that the Democratic AGs are defending aspirational hiring goals. And I think on one level, on the most basic level, most companies, regardless of their political orientation, aspire for all workplaces to be diverse and for our great American society, to be a place where people of every race and background come and thrive in a meritocracy. The question is really now just how we're going to get there.